Alright, so Apple just unleashed their new 5nm ARM-based M1 processor, and I have to say, I was pretty surprised they managed to launch it in not one, not two, but three of their product lines. That means we are getting a new Mac Mini, a new MacBook Air, and a new MacBook Pro 13. Now, don't get me wrong, yes, they are still almost exactly the same in design, but this new processor promises a lot of improvement in a number of different domains. Now, I've been a big fan of the A12X Bionic processor in my 2018 iPad Pro. It easily handles my 4K video edits, and battery life outperforms my Dell XPS 9300. The new M1 processor has a design carried over from the processor of my iPad Pro. That is, 4 high-performance cores and 4 energy-efficient cores for the CPU, an integrated 8-core GPU, and memory that is housed within the same chip package, all integrated in what Apple is terming unified memory architecture. And whilst that is all similar to the iPad Pro's ARM-based processors, the M1 ups the ante by shrinking down to a smaller 5nm manufacturing process from 7nm. This theoretically translates to more power efficiency and less heat production. Now, throughout the presentation, Apple makes various bold claims about the processor sporting 3.5 times the performance over competing CPUs and 3 times more power per watt than the latest PC laptop chip. And whilst that's super vague and holds very little meaning, I do think that this chip will be more power efficient and perform at least somewhat better than its predecessors for compatible apps like Final Cut. Until people are able to actually test these claims out, we will just have to wait and see. So let's move on to the actual products. And I wanted to start off discussing the MacBook Air. Now, the reason why I'm most excited about the product line is the fact that you will be getting the same M1 processor as the MacBook Pro. Now, this has several theoretical advantages. The first is that you may get a similar level of performance in the MacBook Air versus the Pro for less money. Now, previously, the MacBook Pro had a faster, more power-hungry Intel CPU, and that was one of the reasons to justify the price gap between the two. Now that they are running the same chipset, you could technically get the MacBook Air and save yourself $400 over the now comparable MacBook Pro, given the fact that they have the same M1 processor. The other reason to go for the MacBook Pro prior to the M1 release was because of the screen. But Apple has now updated the MacBook Air with M1 so that the screen supports P3 wide color gamut, making it even more similar to the MacBook Pro. Now, a few caveats exist though. The MacBook Air does not have any active cooling, and this proved detrimental for its Intel lineup this year, as many users had run into issues with thermal management and throttling. It's impossible to say whether this is going to be reflected in the upcoming M1 release. However, the iPad Air seems to hold up pretty well with an ARM-based chip and no active cooling, so it may not actually be as big of a deal. Now, the second reason to jump for the MacBook Air is the fact you'll be getting a lighter MacBook with the same number of ports, but again with a similar level of CPU and GPU performance and a similar screen. This may change later as Apple starts to expand the number of devices with the M1 chip, but currently only the 2 USB-C port basic MacBook Pro houses the M1 chip, meaning there's no advantage in terms of port selection between the MacBook Air and the new MacBook Pro. In addition, I also think these ports will support Thunderbolt 4 as per the presentation, so that's a nice plus. So why get the MacBook Pro over the MacBook Air if it's more expensive and potentially has a similar level of performance capabilities? Well, the first is the speaker setup and microphone quality. Apple has essentially upgraded the MacBook Pro speaker and microphone to make it more studio-worthy. The MacBook Air speakers were always not as good as the MacBook Pro, but I think the gap widens slightly more with the new improvements made to the M1 MacBook Pro. The second is the battery life. Now, the MacBook Pro has always had a larger capacity battery compared to the MacBook Air, but the fact that they will now share the same chipset, that's more power efficient, means the MacBook Pro touts an impressive 20-hour battery life as opposed to the 18 hours of the new MacBook Air. Finally, the MacBook Pro still has the touch bar, but whether that's an actual advantage, well, that depends on your preference. Now, some other quick takeaways from the presentation. It seems like Apple has finally listened to users by improving the image processing of the webcam. Essentially, this means better noise reduction and dynamic range. I still would have liked an upgrade to the actual hardware, but this is a step in the right direction. The other interesting capability of the M1 chip is being able to use apps from the iOS and iPadOS system. I'm not exactly certain on how it would work, but it seems like you can just download any of your iPhone or iPad apps and run it on these new M1 based MacBooks. Also, the Mac Mini is the third Apple product to house the M1 chip, and although I've never really seen much utility in using a Mac Mini, I guess for those that are looking for a compact desktop setup capable of things like video editing or web browsing, this would be a good alternative. Now, on this note, I think it is important to talk about the use cases for these new M1 based Macs. Apple claims that the graphics have improved a lot with the new M1 chip, but the game demos shown, I just have to be honest, they were just trash. And I don't think we would see much improvement in terms of gaming performance for these ARM-based chips in general. The reality is game manufacturers want to push games that look and play well, and this is most easily done when using a Windows PC with a dedicated graphics card. In terms of other apps though, if you are the person that kind of sticks to Apple-based apps like video editing with Final Cut Pro or web browsing with Safari, I'm sure you will reap the benefits of this new M1 chip. Other apps I think will take longer to become optimized to the new MacBooks, for example, Adobe Lightroom or Adobe Photoshop. But I think that developers would want to capitalize on the performance capabilities of the new M1. Why? Well, because Apple will no longer make Intel-based Macs, and Macs in general, they are very popular. So unlike Windows Surface X, which flopped on its ARM-based processor because developers just didn't want to commit to a device that not many people would buy, developers this time, well, they are going to develop for the M1 chip. So if you are worried about app support, yes, it might be initially slow, but it will eventually come. Now, about pricing. Both MacBook Air and MacBook Pro are priced the same as their preceding Intel counterparts. The Mac Mini is $100 cheaper than its predecessor. Again, as a first adopter, there will likely be a distinct lack of programs that you'll be able to use initially. But if you are someone who's tied into Apple's ecosystem and primarily use Apple-based apps, then this represents good value. So to wrap things up, I'm excited to see what the performance capabilities and support for these new M1 based Macs will be like. As someone who uses their iPad frequently for video editing and work, it would be super nice to have that same fluid experience and performance on macOS Big Sur. But alongside that, also have very decent battery life. So let me know of your thoughts below and whether you would like me to review one of these new Macs. Give a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe for more videos to come. I'll keep my eye out, but until the next one, see ya.